The notice arrived on a gray October morning in 1883, delivered by a young man who could not quite meet Clara Whitmore's eyes. Mr. Briggs, 24 years old, soft-handed, visibly miserable about his errand, stood at the door of the company house with the envelope held out in front of him, like a man presenting something mildly poisonous. Clara took it from him without expression, noted the Denver postmark and the Silver King Mining Company seal pressed into the wax, and stepped back from the doorway without inviting him in. She read it standing at the kitchen table the way she read anything that required her full attention, standing up, one hand flat on the wood surface, weight forward, as though she might need to move quickly afterward. The letter was 4 paragraphs. She read all 4 twice. When she looked up, Briggs was still in the doorway, his hat turning slowly in his hands. He delivered the prepared speech about the company's sympathy. He mentioned Denver. He mentioned that a wagon could be arranged free of charge to transport her belongings to whatever destination she chose. He mentioned, with the careful phrasing of a man repeating something he has memorized, that the company recognized the difficulty of her circumstances. Clara let him finish. Then she asked the only question that mattered: "Where exactly am I supposed to go, Mr. Briggs?" He suggested pensions in Denver. He mentioned that women in her situation often return to family. Clara's voice did not rise, did not crack, did not take on any of the qualities that would have made it easier for him to file her response away as emotional and therefore ignorable. She was factual. She was 39 years old. Her parents had died of cholera in Iowa when she was 16. James's family in Ohio had severed contact the year he married her, and not a single letter had passed between them in the 6 years since. She had $65 coming to her as full settlement for James's death and 6 years of his labor underground. The pensions in Denver hired young women capable of working 14-hour laundry shifts. They did not hire widows approaching 40 with no connections and no references beyond a mining camp in the Colorado mountains. Briggs looked at the floor. He was not a bad man. She could see that clearly enough. He was a young man doing a job that someone above him had decided was his responsibility, and he was doing it as gently as he could, which was not very gently at all, because the thing itself admitted no gentleness. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that was not in the prepared speech. Something he said in a lower register and without looking at her directly, something that had the quality of words a person releases sideways because they cannot say them straight. "Mrs. Whitmore, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but there's a Mr. Garrett coming from the Denver engineering office in the spring to review the records from the July incident, if you were still in the area by then." He stopped himself. He shook his head slightly. "I'm sorry, I genuinely am. Good luck to you." He was down the path and around the bend before she could decide whether to call after him. She did not call after him. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the place where he'd been. Then she went back inside and put water on the stove. The house was small, even by the standards of company housing at Silver King Mine. 2 rooms on the lower level, a sleeping loft reached by a ladder, a porch that caught the morning sun for about 40 minutes before the ridge cut it off. She and James had made it livable through the particular domestic intelligence of people who understand that comfort is not a function of space, but of intention. There were curtains she'd sewn from feed sacks dyed with wild onion skins. There was a shelf James had built into the wall above the stove, precisely the right height, exactly the right depth. The kind of thing a man builds when he has studied the way his wife moves in a kitchen long enough to understand it. There were his books, 11 of them, lined on the windowsill where the light hit them in the afternoon. She did not look in the books. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen table and read the letter a 3rd time. The terms were plain. She had until the 1st of November. The house was required for the new shift foreman arriving from Nevada with his wife and 3 children. $65 represented the company's full and final obligation. She had, by her count, 3 weeks. She did not cry. She had not cried since July when they'd brought James up from the tunnel, 4 collapsed in a way that made identification a matter of his boots and his wedding ring. She had not cried at the funeral which 6 men attended, including herself. She had not cried in the weeks after when the company's representative came to discuss the settlement and used the word unfortunate 4 times in 11 minutes. She had decided sometime in August, going to spend whatever came next leaking. Leaking was what you did when you thought something might still be salvageable. She was past that. What she needed now was not release. It was arithmetic. She got out paper. She wrote numbers. Denver $65 against the cheapest available room in a boarding house, which Edmund Hale at the general store had told her ran about $7 a month if you were lucky and willing to share. That gave her roughly 9 months of shelter with nothing left for food. If she found work within the first 2 months, she might extend it. But work at 39 with no trade skills that translated to city labor, no family name that opens the doors, no history of employment, which beyond helping James with his survey, notes and managing a household on a company income work was not a thing she could count as a given. Denver was a city of arriving people, younger people, people who had not already spent 6 years at 9,000 feet breathing thin air and hauling water up a slope. The boarding houses hired girls who could scrub floors at 5 in the morning after already hauling coal since 4. The arithmetic did not work. Letters to distant relations. There were 2 cousins in Pennsylvania she had not spoken to in 11 years. She did not know their current addresses. A letter would take 3 weeks to arrive if it arrived at all, and the response, if one came, would take another 3 weeks, and by then November 1st would have passed, and she would already need to have been somewhere. The arithmetic did not work. Remarriage, she held this option in her mind long enough to assess it honestly. There were widowers in the camp. There were single men. The prospect of attaching herself to a stranger out of desperation in the span of 3 weeks with winter coming was not something she examined with sentiment. She examined it as logistics. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. It put her survival in someone else's hands in a way that every other option, however bleak, did not. She crossed it off the list. That left the mountains. She did not write this option down at first. She sat with it. The idea of staying not in the camp, not in company housing, but in the mountains themselves, in the physical landscape that had been her home for 6 years, had a quality she could not immediately categorize as rational or irrational. James had loved these mountains in the way that some people love things that could kill them, with clear eyes and without sentimentality. He had spent his days off exploring ridgelines and creek beds and granite formations, not for minerals, though he noted those too, but because he found the landscape genuinely interesting in the way that a mind built for problem solving finds interesting anything that rewards close attention. He had come home from those walks the way other men came home from church. She pulled his box out from under the bed. It was a wooden crate he'd kept under his side of the mattress locked with a small brass latch, and she had not opened it since August because opening it had not felt necessary, and also because some part of her had known that what was inside would require her to make decisions she was not yet ready to make. She opened it now. Inside, 3 hand-drawn maps, pencil on heavy paper folded, with the careful precision of a man who understood that maps were tools, and tools needed to remain usable. A collection of rock samples wrapped in cloth scraps labeled in his handwriting with location and date. A small ledger of survey notes, and underneath all of it, a journal, thick, dark blue, cover the corners worn soft from being carried in a coat pocket. She had known about the journal. She had not read it. She did it now, beginning at the first page and moving forward with the patient attention of someone looking for a specific thing without knowing its exact shape. James's handwriting was dense and slanted, left the handwriting of a man who thought faster than he wrote and had compensated by compressing the letters. She read for 2 hours through entries about geological formations and weather observations, and the particular quality of light on the peaks at different times of year through small domestic notes, a good meal, a sore shoulder, the way the camp sounded on Sunday mornings when the machinery was quiet, until she reached the entry dated September 14th, 1881. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. He had found a granite cave on the south-facing slope of the western ridge, approximately 1 mile from the camp. Deep, he wrote, perhaps 30 feet. Wide enough to stand in comfortably with a natural chimney fissure in the ceiling that drew air upward in a clear current. Dry, which he underlined. Completely thoroughly dry despite its position above a seasonal creek bed. The entrance faced south and would receive direct sun for most of a winter day. The location was obscured by fallen timber and scrub growth not visible from any trail or road. A person would have to know to look for it. He had noted the approach from the camp, take the main trail north until the second fork, then bear west along the ridgeline until the large split boulder that looked like a chair from the eastern approach, then drop down the slope 50 yards bearing southwest. He had noted that the cave would serve excellently as emergency shelter for anyone who needed it if they knew it was there. He had underlined that last clause as well. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she finished reading. Outside, the camp was making its usual afternoon sounds, the distant thud of the stamp mill, the voices of men coming off the day shift, someone's dog conducting an argument with the wind. She was aware of all of this as background, the way you are aware of weather through a window. Then she got up and started planning. She spent 2 days in methodical preparation before she went to look for the cave. She needed to know what she was looking at before she committed to anything. She made a list of what building a functional winter shelter would require, working from James's description of the cave's dimensions and her own practical knowledge of what a body needed to survive 5 months of high-altitude winter. Heat, dryness, food, water from snowmelt, a door, a way to cook, a way to store firewood where it would stay dry. She wrote all of it down with estimated costs beside each item, with notes about what could be sourced from the landscape and what would have to be purchased. She worked the numbers until she knew them cold. She told no one this was deliberate. The camp was a small world, 340 people living in close proximity, in conditions that encouraged both community and gossip, and what she was considering was the kind of thing that, if mentioned prematurely, would generate opinions she did not want to manage. She moved through the next 2 days with the surface behavior of a woman in the process of packing up and moving on, which was what everyone expected. And underneath that surface, she was doing something else entirely. On the third morning, she left the camp at first light and went to find the cave. James had written the approach from the perspective of a man who'd walked it on a September morning, tracking the sun. Clara arrived at the second fork and bore west along the ridgeline the same way, but the October light fell differently from the September light. The sun lower, the shadows longer. The boulder he'd described as looking like a chair, looking from the east like nothing so much as a pile of rocks with ambitions. She stood at the fork for 10 minutes, studying the terrain. She went west. She went too far west, past a second split boulder she almost convinced herself was the right one, until the slope became too steep to have been what he meant. She came back. She ate an apple. She studied the journal entry again, this time reading it as a set of instructions rather than an observation, and noticed that the 50 yards bearing southwest was from the boulder, specifically, not from the ridgeline in general. The light was starting to go when she found the boulder. She dropped down the slope 50 yards southwest and stopped. Nothing. She pushed through a stand of scrub pine that scratched at her coat sleeves and found herself at the base of a granite wall, and then at the edge of her lamplight, the darkness inside the wall that was not shadow but depth. The entrance was smaller looking than James had made it sound, partially blocked by 2 fallen pine trunks and a growth of dry brush that had spent the summer doing its best to reclaim the opening. She moved the brush aside by hand, pulled one of the smaller pine trunks back far enough to clear passage, and lit the torch she'd brought, a branch wrapped in pine resin-soaked cloth, and stepped inside. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust beyond the torch, letting the space come into focus. The ceiling rose. The walls open. James had written 30 feet deep and 12 feet wide, but the chamber widened in its middle section to something broader than 12 feet, closer to 15, before narrowing again toward the rear. The ceiling at the highest point, roughly in the center of the chamber, was 9 feet, and it curved in a way that was not architectural, but was arch-like, all the same granite worn smooth by time into a shape that a builder would have had to design deliberately. The floor was uneven, covered in decades of organic debris, dust, and small rocks, but it was not chaotic. It sloped gently from the rear toward the entrance, which was exactly what you wanted for drainage. She moved deeper. The torch pushed the shadows back. On the right wall, about 2/3 of the way to the rear, there was a narrow fissure in the granite running from a point about 4 feet off the floor up into the ceiling and disappearing into darkness above. She held the torch near it. The flame bent not from a draft at floor level, but from the pull of the fissure itself, drawing air upward. She held her hand to it. There was a current, faint but consistent. The cave had a natural chimney, and it worked. At the rear of the chamber, she found what James had not mentioned: a circle of old ash, long dead and compressed by time into a gray disk on the stone floor. Beside it, a piece of canvas tarpaulin folded into a rough rectangle, stiff with age and beginning to fragment at the folds. Someone had sheltered here before. Not recently. The tarp could have been years old, a decade old. She did not know their story. She could construct a dozen versions of it, What she knew was the ending. They had been here and then they had gone, which meant they had survived whatever brought them here and moved on under their own power. She found the knife in a crack at the base of the right wall, wedged in sideways as if placed deliberately, a working knife, not a pocket knife with a 4-inch blade that had gone to rust along the flat, but was intact at the edge. The handle was wood darkened by hand oil and time, but solid. She wrapped it in her handkerchief and put it in her coat pocket. She did not know why. It felt like the right thing to do with a tool that still had use in it. She stayed in the cave for an hour, moving methodically, touching the walls, pressing her palm flat against the granite to feel its texture and temperature, looking at every surface with the practical attention of someone making a decision that cannot be unmade once made. The stone was cold, but not wet. No seepage anywhere. No cracks with the particular character of active fractures. The stone was old and settled and had made its final arrangements with gravity a very long time ago. The south-facing entrance, she confirmed by the angle of the last of the evening light filtering in, would collect winter sun directly for most of the short days ahead. The overhang above the entrance was deep enough to shed rain and snow without blocking the light. She stood in the center of the chamber, in the near dark, the torch burning down, and made the decision that would determine the next several years of her life. She was not going to Denver. She was not going to write to Pennsylvania cousins she had not spoken to in 11 years. She was not going to attach herself to a stranger's household out of desperation or spend the last of James's settlement on 9 months of borrowed time in a city that did not want her. She was going to stay in these mountains, in this cave, in the landscape that had been her home, and she was going to build something that would keep her alive. She walked back to camp in full dark. She was not afraid of the dark on this mountain. She had lived here 6 years. She spent the following day working the numbers a second time, this time with the cave's specifics in mind rather than the abstract concept of outdoor survival. The plan was not primitive, it was precise. She would close the cave entrance with a stone wall, create interior zones for living and for wood storage, install the small cast iron stove with its pipe rooted to the natural chimney fissure, and accumulate a minimum of 3 cords of dry firewood before the first serious snow. The cave's granite mass would act as thermal storage, absorbing heat from the stove during burning hours and releasing it slowly through the cold hours. The entrance wall, properly sealed, would block wind and precipitation entirely. The natural chimney would handle ventilation without the efficiency loss of a conventional flue penetrating an exterior wall. She ran the numbers on firewood consumption. She ran the numbers on food. She wrote down everything she needed to buy in order of priority, with prices from memory based on what she'd seen on Edmund Hale's shelves. The total came to $38.50 for tools and materials, leaving $26.50 for food and contingency. It was tight. There was no margin for mistakes. She went to Edmund Hale's store on the morning of October 21st. Edmund Hale was 58 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the hands of a man who had spent 20 years in physical labor before transitioning to the physical labor of running a general store in a mining camp, which was different in character, but not in intensity. He had known Clara and James for the full 6 years they'd been at Silver King, and he had sold James every tool the man had ever bought and listened to him talk about geology with the patient attention of someone who did not fully understand the subject but recognized genuine enthusiasm when he encountered it. He was not a sentimental man. He was a fair one, which is sometimes more useful. He read Clara's list without speaking. He read it a second time. He set it on the counter and looked at it rather than at her for a moment, and she could see him doing what she had been doing for 3 days, running numbers, making spatial assessments, trying to understand the shape of the plan behind the list of materials. Then he looked up. "Clara," he said, "this is a builder's list, not a packing list." She told him what she was planning briefly and without apology. She told him about the cave, its dimensions, its chimney fissure, its south-facing entrance. She told him about the wall she intended to build and why stone rather than timber. She did not tell him she was frightened. She was not frightened. What she was could not be separated cleanly into a single emotion. It was something more like the focused alertness of a person standing at the edge of a decision that is both necessary and irrevocable. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He reached under the counter for a sheet of brown paper and a pencil and sat down on his stool and began to draw. He had been a builder for 20 years before the store, he said, stonework specifically for his first 8 years. He knew dry stone construction the way he knew his own hands. He would not be able to come up and help her as the store ran 6 days a week and he ran it alone. But there were things she needed to understand before she laid a single rock, and he was going to tell her. He explained the principle of overlapping joints, how every stone in a dry stone wall must bridge the gap between two stones in the row below so that there is no continuous vertical line of weakness running from bottom to top. He drew it clearly on the brown paper with short lines showing the staggered pattern. He explained the slight inward lean 5 to 10 degrees from vertical, that directed the weight of the wall inward and downward rather than outward and into instability. He explained the lintel, the flat spanning stone that would bridge the doorway opening, and the importance of distributing weight onto its ends rather than its center. He talked for 30 minutes. Clara listened the way she listened to everything that might save her life completely, without interruption, filing each point in a sequence she would be able to access under physical fatigue and cold, and the particular cognitive compression of hard work. When he was finished, she went through her list item by item. The good shovel, $4. The pickaxe, $3. The handsaw, $2. The hammer, $1. 2 boxes of nails at 40 cents each. The cast iron wood stove with pipe sections, $8, and Edmund went to the back and checked his inventory because this was the item that could not be substituted. He had one. She bought it. The quicklime mortar, $1.50 for 10 pounds, which she calculated would be enough to seal the face courses of the wall without mortaring the interior, a technique that saved material while achieving most of the weatherproofing benefit. The canvas, tarpaulin, $3. The lantern and oil, $1.75. A good knife, 80 cents. Though she already had the one from the cave, she bought this one anyway because tools in her situation were not redundant. They were insurance. The food, 50 pounds of flour at $3. 20 pounds of dried beans at $1.40. 10 pounds of salt pork at $2. Salt, sugar, coffee, and baking powder together at $3. Matches, soap, and basic medical supplies, $2 for all of it. The total was $38.50, which left her $26.50, which was not a comfortable margin, but was a margin. Edmund loaded everything into a borrowed handcart. When it was full, he went to the back of the store and came out with additional items he set on top of the load without asking her opinion. A bundle of extra candles, a coil of good rope, a roll of clean cloth suitable for bandaging, a small tin of pine tar. "You'll need all of it," he said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man choosing between several things he might say. What he chose was, "Don't be too proud to come back if you need something." Being proud about the wrong things has killed more people in these mountains than the cold has. She thanked him and meant it, and began the first of what would become 3 trips to move everything up to the cave. The first trip took most of the afternoon. The route was uphill, and the cart was not built for mountain terrain. She loaded it as heavily as she judged she could manage, which turned out to be slightly heavier than she could comfortably manage, and she stopped 4 times on the ascent to breathe and adjust her grip and decide whether to remove items from the load or simply keep going. She kept going each time. She cached everything inside the cave entrance and walked back down in the early dark. The second trip the next morning covered the stove and pipe sections and the remaining tools. The third trip the afternoon of October 23rd brought the last of the food and the mortar. She set up a temporary camp at the cave entrance on the evening of the 23rd bedroll, on the cave floor tarp propped to cover the opening fire built from dry wood she'd gathered on the last trip up. The fire was small because she was being careful with matches. It was enough. The cave held the warmth in a way that surprised her, even though she had predicted it. The granite walls reflected the heat back instead of absorbing it away, and the small fire raised the ambient temperature in the chamber noticeably within 20 minutes. She ate her supper beans, cooked over the fire, a biscuit coffee, and then sat with the tin cup in both hands and let herself be still for the first time in 3 days. The fire made the shadows move on the granite walls. Outside, the wind was running along the ridge in long, uneven gusts that she could hear but not feel inside the cave. The tarp over the entrance moved at its edges. She thought about James, not the July version of him, not the version that arrived at the edges of her mind in August with the particular weight of unfinished grief. The earlier version, the man who had come home from his walks along this ridgeline, with his coat pockets full of rock samples and his eyes bright with whatever problem the landscape had set him. The man who had found this cave and stood in it, she imagined the same way she'd stood in it 2 days ago, turning slowly, reading its features, and had thought someone could use this. He had known the cave was here and had written down how to find it. He had understood its value and had described it clearly enough that she'd been able to find it from his words. In the most practical possible sense, he was still taking care of her. She was in a cave on the side of a Colorado mountain in October because he had explored it on a September afternoon 2 years ago and thought to write it down. There were worse things to carry forward from a marriage than that. She finished her coffee. She put the fire down to coals and laid out her bedroll on the stone floor cold hard, not impossible, and pulled the blankets up. The cave around her was dark and close and smelled of stone and old ash and pine resin from the torch. She could hear her own breathing and outside the wind and nothing else. She had been sleeping badly since July. She had lain awake in the company house through long nights that did not lead anywhere, turning over the same facts in the same order and arriving at the same absence. Tonight was different. Tonight there was a plan. It was a hard plan, difficult and uncertain, and requiring her to do things she had never done before and to do them alone, and to do them fast enough that the mountain did not kill her before she finished. But it was a real plan built on real resources aimed at a real outcome. For the first time in 3 months, she had something to do tomorrow that was not just surviving the day. Clara Whitmore closed her eyes in the belly of a granite mountain, and for the first time since July, she did not lie awake. She began, before the light was full on the morning of October 25th, building the fire from coals she'd banked the night before, and eating standing-up coffee and a cold biscuit, because sitting down felt like a concession to comfort she had not yet earned. The first task was not the wall. The first task was the floor, and the floor meant 2 full days of work that would leave nothing visible to stand back and assess at the end of each evening, nothing to point to and call progress. She did it anyway because she understood that everything coming after would rest on what she did now, and a poor foundation was not a thing you could patch later. You could only tear it out and start again, which was a luxury she did not have. The debris inside this cave had accumulated in the way things accumulate in an undisturbed space over a long time, not dramatically, not in visible layers, but in the settled, compressed way of years. Dead pine needles that had blown in through seasons of open entrance, sifted down and become something closer to soil. Small rocks, some fallen from the ceiling during freeze-thaw cycles, some carried in by water that no longer ran. Animal scat from creatures who had used the cave in the decades between James's visit and now. The ash circle from the unknown earlier occupant, which she was careful with, she moved it in pieces rather than scattering it out of some instinct she didn't examine closely. It seemed right to treat even a stranger's fire with a degree of care. She worked from the back of the chamber toward the entrance, sweeping and shoveling, carrying the debris out and depositing it 20 feet downslope. By the end of the first day, her hands were dirty to the wrist in a way that did not come clean with cold water, and she had removed enough material to understand the true character of the floor beneath. The granite sloped as she'd estimated from rear to entrance, a gentle grade, perhaps 3 degrees, which was ideal for drainage, but which would make a sleeping platform necessary. The floor was not smooth. It was a collection of irregular granite protrusions and depressions, some shallow enough to ignore, some deep enough to require filling. She made a mental map of it as she worked. By the end of the second day of clearing, October 26th, the cave was clean in the functional sense, not sterile, not swept down to bare stone everywhere, but cleared of everything that did not belong to the structure itself. She stood at the entrance and looked back through the space and could see it now for what it was, not a hole in the mountain, but a room. Irregular, cold, imperfect, with walls that were not walls in any conventional sense, and a ceiling that made its own decisions about height depending on where you stood. But a room, with dimensions she could work with and a character she was beginning to understand. She spent the next 3 days on the foundation work. She collected granite from the slope outside. The mountain was generous with this offering, fragments of every size from fist size to blocks that would have required 2 men and a lever under ordinary circumstances. She wanted the mid-range pieces for the foundation work, roughly the size and weight of a loaf of bread, heavy enough to stay where she put them, but light enough that she could place them precisely without machinery or assistance. She carried them in by hand 2 or 3 at a time, organizing them by size along the right wall of the cave before she started placing. The foundation work was unglamorous and unambiguous. She was building low stone borders along both sides of the interior, creating a raised, roughly level platform in the center section, where she would sleep and live while leaving the channel between the borders and the lower zone near the entrance clear for drainage. Each stone had to be placed with its flattest face upward and its most stable orientation downward and tested before she moved on. She stepped on each one, applied her weight in a slow shift from one side to the other, listening for any movement that would mean settling later. A stone that rocked slightly could be shamed. A stone that rocked substantially had to come out and be replaced. She did not rush this assessment. She had learned from watching James take measurements that the discipline of doing a thing right the first time was not perfectionism, it was efficiency, because the cost of going back was always higher than the cost of going carefully forward. Her back began registering its opinion on the third day of this work, a dull, specific complaint centered in the muscles just above her hips that tightened overnight and was worst in the first hour after waking. She adjusted her posture when she could bend from the knees rather than the waist. When she remembered and accepted the discomfort as information rather than complaint, it told her how she was using her body and where she needed to redistribute the load. Her hands were developing calluses over calluses. The granite was not forgiving to skin. She wore her work gloves until they began to fail at the seams, then switched to wrapping strips of canvas around her palms when the gloves gave out entirely. On the fourth day of building the foundation, she was moving a stone she'd underestimated, perhaps 60 pounds, which was at the upper limit of what she could shift, with good footing and control along a section of wet soil near the entrance where morning dew had condensed on the stone. Her left foot found the slick patch before her attention did. The stone kept its momentum. She did not. Her right knee struck the granite floor with the full efficiency of gravity and poor timing, and she went down sideways and stayed there. The pain was immediate and complete, the kind that occupies your entire awareness for 30 seconds and leaves no room for anything else. She lay on her side on the cave floor with her eyes closed and her teeth pressed together and waited for it to peak and then begin to recede because that was what pain did, and she knew how to wait. When it had reduced itself from urgent to merely severe, she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. The granite arch curved above her in the lamplight. She could see the fissure from here, the natural chimney running up into the dark, and the faint movement of the torch flame near the floor told her the draft was still running, pulling upward, as it always did. She lay there for 10 minutes. She let herself lie there because there was no one watching, and she was not going to perform recovery for her own benefit. And in those 10 minutes on the cold stone floor of a granite cave with her knee throbbing and the mountain pressing down on all sides, the question she had been keeping behind the wall of practical activity finally came through. She had spent 3 weeks building an argument for staying alive in this place, building it in numbers and lists and tool inventories, and the argument was sound. She still believed it was sound. But there was a version of reality in which she was a 39-year-old woman lying on the floor of a cave with a hurt knee and no one within a mile who knew where she was. And that version was also true, and she was living in it right now. She held both versions. She did not try to resolve them into one. Then she asked herself the other question, the counterweight. If she walked off this mountain tomorrow and went to Denver, where would she be in 4 months? She ran the answer and found it unchanged from 3 weeks ago. The arithmetic still did not work. The cave still represented the only path that led somewhere other than a predictable and quiet failure. She was going to stay. The decision did not need to be made again. She was just confirming it. She stood up. Her knee protested in the specific register of deep tissue that had been compressed too quickly. Something bruised rather than broken, functional, but unhappy. She went back to work and redistributed her footing habits so that her left leg was doing more of the stabilizing work. By noon, she had placed 40 more stones. She was working outside at the entrance to the cave on the morning of November 3rd, sorting the best flat stones from a pile she'd assembled over the previous days, when she became aware that she was not alone on the slope. The awareness arrived not as a sound, but as a change in the quality of the silence, the specific absence of certain ambient sounds, bird movement in particular, that meant something larger than a bird had been stationary nearby long enough for the small life of the slope to reorganize around it. She continued sorting without changing her posture or her pace, And after a moment, she said without looking up, "How long have you been standing there?" Frank Dolan was standing 15 feet upslope, his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who has been watching something he has not yet made up his mind about. He was 44, built across the shoulders like a man who had spent 2 decades underground, with a pickaxe, with a face that had been weathered to the particular texture of someone who has spent equivalent time at altitude. He was not Clara knew from camp acquaintance, a man who spoke when silence would serve. "Long enough," he said. She looked up then. They assessed each other for a moment with the frankness of people who do not have the social energy for pretense. "What do you want?" she asked him. His answer was blunt and without malice. "I wanted to see how far you'd get before you gave up." She stood up from the stone pile. She was not offended. She could see in his face that he wasn't being cruel, he was being honest, which was different. He had watched from the web as she made her trips up the slope with the handcart. He had formed an assessment. He was here to see whether the assessment was correct. "You can stay and watch," she told him, "or you can help me move that stone." She pointed at the lintel candidate she'd been thinking about for 2 days, a flat granite slab 4 feet long and roughly 8 inches wide, weighing somewhere north of 80 pounds, which she had not yet found a method to lift into position alone without risking it falling on her. Frank looked at the stone. He looked at the half-built wall where the stone would need to go. He did the spatial arithmetic she had already done. Then he uncrossed his arms and walked over to the stone without saying anything else. It took both of them 40 minutes to position the lintel building, the temporary supports on each side of the door opening, using the long branch she'd been using as a lever, to inch the slab up incrementally, checking the level with a string line she'd stretched between 2 points on the existing wall. When the slab finally settled into position across the opening, resting on the support stones on each end, with its full weight distributed exactly the way Edmund's diagram had specified, Clara did not celebrate. She checked it from 3 angles, pressed on the center with both palms, and then removed one of the temporary supports slowly to confirm the spanning action was holding. It held. Frank stood back and looked at it. Solid, he said. It was, by his vocabulary, a significant endorsement. He picked up his coat from where he'd left it on the rock pile and put it on. He left without ceremony, heading down slope toward the camp. Clara watched him go and then went back to work. He came back the next morning with his own axe. He didn't announce himself or ask what needed doing. He looked at the wood pile she'd started, the beginning of what would need to be an enormous quantity of split firewood, and he began cutting. They worked within 50 feet of each other for 4 hours and exchanged perhaps a dozen words. When he left at midday, the woodpile was measurably larger. Clara noted this without sentiment, the way she noted all changes in her situation. It was a fact. It improved her odds. She was grateful for it. The wall grew through the first week of November with a pace that was slower than she'd estimated and faster than she'd feared. The fundamental principle she worked by, every stone bridging the joint between the two below it, required selecting each piece with an attention that could not be hurried. She would pick up a stone, hold it, turn it, visualize its position in the wall, set it against the course below, and check the bridge, then either place it or put it back. Some stones she tried from 3 or 4 different orientations before finding the one that worked. Some she put back in the pile entirely and spent 20 minutes finding a better candidate. The work had a quality of 3-dimensional problem solving that was cognitively demanding in a way she found unexpectedly satisfying. Not the satisfaction of easy work well done, but the satisfaction of difficult work that required her full intelligence, and received it. The wall was not going to be beautiful. That was not the point. The point was that each stone would be held in place by the combined weight and geometry of its neighbors, and that the whole assembly would resist wind and snow and the lateral pressure of a cold season without mortar doing the primary work. Mortar was finish work. The structure itself had to be sound without it. As the wall rose above waist height, she built a ramp of packed earth against the exterior face, allowing her to roll or drag the heavier upper course stones up to working height without lifting them from the ground. The ramp changed the geometry of the problem. Instead of a lifting problem, she had a sliding problem, which was more tractable. She used the rope Edmund had included in the supplies to control stones on their way up the ramp, looping it around each stone and paying it out slowly so the weight didn't get ahead of her. The mortar joints she completed in sections as each course dried. not mortaring the full interior of the wall, which would have consumed her entire supply in the first 3 feet, but packing the face courses on both sides with quicklime mortar, mixed to a thick consistency she could push into the gaps with a flat stick. The interior of the wall remained dry stacked, which preserved its flexibility and drainage properties. The faces were sealed. When rain came in the second week of November, cold rain that arrived sideways on a northeast wind, she observed from inside the cave that no water was finding its way through the wall. The stone on the interior face was dry to the touch, even at the base where the exterior ground would be saturated. On the morning of November 10th, she set the last stones in the crown course, the final row at the top, which she'd selected with particular care for flatness of top surface to shed water away from the joints. She stepped back from the wall and looked at it from inside the cave, then went outside and looked at it from the mountain. It was not uniform. The stones varied in color and size, in the way that local granite varied, and the courses were not perfectly horizontal. They followed the natural topography of the opening rather than an imposed line. But it stood straight in its overall profile. It was thick and stable at its base, and it had the particular visual quality of something that belongs to the landscape that produced it, rather than something imposed on that landscape from outside. The doors she built from split timber over the following 3 days. She had no sawmill boards available and could not afford to buy them. She split the timber herself with her hatchet and wooden wedges, selecting standing dead trees from the surrounding forest, ones that had died and dried upright, and would therefore give cleaner wood than fallen timber that had begun to rot from contact with the ground. The work produced planks that were rough and uneven but structurally sound, and she built the door in the traditional board and batten configuration with horizontal backing boards nailed to the vertical faceboards in a Z pattern that resisted racking. The iron hinges she'd bought at Edmund's store went into a timber frame she'd set into the stone opening. As she built up the final courses of the wall, she'd known the frame would need to be there and had planned for it, bedding it in mortar at the contact points with the stone. The door hung slightly off level, which she corrected with a strip of wood shimmied under the lower hinge plate. When she pulled it closed for the first time and applied her shoulder to test it, the door did not move. The gaps at the edges she would caulk later with clay mixed with dry grass, a technique she had read about in one of James's survey references for frontier construction. It was not a beautiful door, it was a door that worked. She lit the stove for the first time on the evening of November 10th. She had installed the stove pipe through the wall at a height she'd calculated based on the draft direction she'd observed from the fissure, high enough to clear the wall top and angled toward the natural chimney, low enough to be manageable. She'd packed clay around the pipe penetration at the wall, both inside and out, and let it cure for 3 days before attempting the first fire. Now she laid the fire in the stove box with dry kindling from the interior woodpile, lit it with one match, and stood back. The smoke went up. It rose into the pipe, traveled the pipe to the fissure, and was drawn up and out by the draft as cleanly as if the chimney had been engineered rather than discovered. The fire caught and grew. The stovetop began to radiate. Within 40 minutes, the air in the chamber had moved from the cave's baseline cold, but not freezing, probably in the mid-40s, to something she would categorize as genuinely warm, somewhere above 55 degrees, and it was still climbing. She put her palm flat against the granite wall to her right and felt for the first time warmth in the stone itself. Not surface warmth from the nearby fire, but the deeper, slower warmth of thermal mass beginning to absorb. The granite was taking the heat in the way. Granite took everything, slowly, completely, and with the intention of keeping it. The wood burned cleanly. It burned cleanly because it was dry, and it was dry because it had been stored inside the cave for 2 weeks, protected from the rain and the morning condensation and the progressive moisture that would have worked its way into any outdoor pile through the sequence of cold nights and warming days that October in the mountains produced. She had not fully understood until she felt it now, the clean, vigorous draw of the flame, the way the fire took without coaxing and held without fussing, how much of the work of winter heating was simply the quality of the fuel. Wet wood cost twice as much heat as dry wood to produce the same output, and costed in smoke and creosote, and the accumulated inefficiency of a fire that was always fighting its own moisture. Her wood had none of that problem. Her wood was as dry as the day it fell. She cooked supper on the stovetop, beans, salt pork, coffee, and ate it sitting on the stone platform she'd built along the right wall with James's journal open on her knee, reading by the lamplight that was steady and clean in the cave's still air. The wind outside was audible but distant, running along the ridge above her. Inside, the lamp flame did not waver. The first storm came on November 15th, and it came without much warning. She was splitting wood outside at mid-morning when the quality of the air changed, pressure, dropping temperature, falling through a threshold rather than along a slope, the smell shifting to something metallic and enormous. She had lived at Silver King long enough to know what that combination meant. She loaded one final armful of cut wood and carried it inside, then began to close up the remaining gaps in the door frame with the clay and grass caulk she'd mixed the day before. She was working against the clock now, the sky to the northwest, going the specific gray of a system that meant business. The snow started at mid-afternoon first as scattered flakes that seemed undecided. Then within 30 minutes as a solid horizontal curtain driven by wind that came off the ridge in long, organized gusts. Clara was still working on the doorframe. The lower left corner had a gap she hadn't fully addressed when the wind began catching the door, itself swinging it on its hinges despite the latch, because the latch was not designed for this kind of lateral pressure. She held the door with one hand and caulked with the other and knew she was losing the contest. Below in the camp, Frank Dolan was at his kitchen table eating the last of the day's meal when he looked out the window. The light on the slope was wrong. There was a lamp burning up there in the weather, the only lamp burning on that slope, because nothing else was up there, and in the weather that was closing down, a lamp burning while someone worked outside meant someone was in trouble with the work. He pulled on his coat. Margaret, his wife, looked up from the stove. "Where are you going in that?" Frank's answer came from the direction of the door. "She's not done with the door yet." Margaret looked out of the window at the weather and then at her husband's back as the door shut behind him. She stood for a moment, then went back to the stove. Some decisions, once understood, needed no further discussion. Frank made the mile-long climb in the teeth of the wind with his collar up and his hat pulled down, and the absolute sure-footed, unhurried pace of a man who has spent years navigating underground in darkness and has learned that panic and haste were the same thing with different names. He reached the cave in 30 minutes. Clara was still at the door, the latch chain over her wrist, her weight against the wood as the wind pushed from outside. Frank assessed the situation in the way he assessed everything quickly without comment, and then put his shoulder against the door and his weight behind it and held it shut, while Clara drove the hinge screws tighter with a flat stone used as a hammer, and then ran the caulk along the remaining gap and packed it with both palms. They worked without conversation. There was nothing to say. The wind said everything that needed saying. At some point past midnight, the wind reached its full strength, which was considerable. The temperature outside dropped to somewhere below zero. Clara could not measure it exactly, but she knew the behavior of cold at this altitude, and what she felt in the brief gap under the door before she'd finished the caulk told her it was serious. Inside the cave, with the stove burning at a moderate level from the interior woodpile and the door fully sealed, the temperature held above 50 degrees. She could feel the cold on the stone near the entrance, but not feel it in the air. The mass of the mountain around her was working exactly the way she'd reasoned it would, absorbing the temperature differential and attenuating it the way stone absorbed everything slowly and released it the same way. Frank sat on the stone bench she'd built and drank the coffee she made, and they were quiet for a while in the particular companionable silence of people who have just finished something difficult together and don't need to narrate it. Eventually he spoke. "You're not going to leave, are you?" It was not a question. Clara looked at him over her own cup. "No," he nodded once, then, "Margaret will want to know you're not dead. She won't say that's why she'll ask, but that's why." Clara held something back that was not quite a smile. "Tell her I'm not dead." Frank finished his coffee and put his cup on the shelf she'd cut into the stone wall. He stood up, put his coat on, and went out into the storm, as if it were a minor inconvenience he'd remembered he had to deal with. The storm lasted 3 days. When it cleared, 2 feet of heavy snow covered everything outside the cave, and the temperature had settled into the upper 20s at midday. Clara shoveled out the area directly in front of her door, noted that her wall and door had shown no movement, no settlement, no infiltration of snow or cold air beyond what she'd already addressed, and went back inside to plan the next phase. December brought the reality of winter fully into play, and with it a problem she had not solved completely. She had known since she ran her original numbers that the food she'd purchased in October was sized for approximately 2 months of careful rationing, not 5. She had known this and had not had a solution for it at the time of purchase, which was not a comfortable thing to have known and set aside. But the priority at that moment had been tools and building materials and getting the shelter closed before the snow came, and she had made that trade-off deliberately. Now the trade-off was due. She sat with it for 2 evenings, running the numbers again and finding them unchanged. She had approximately 8 weeks of food at current consumption. The winter would run at minimum until the end of March, more likely into April. She was short by 6 to 8 weeks. She had $26.50 in reserve. She could buy more food from Edmund, but that meant either making a winter trip down the mountain, not impossible but not trivial in serious snow, or asking someone to bring supplies up, which introduced a dependence she hadn't planned for, and which also cost more than going herself. She opened James's journal to the section she'd read quickly in October, and not returned to the notes about the wildlife of the ridgeline. He had written extensively about the snowshoe hare populations on the south-facing slopes in winter, how they moved in predictable corridors between the spruce stands and the open areas where wind cleared the ground enough to expose the dried grass beneath the snow. He had described watching them for an hour from a high rock one February morning, fascinated by the efficiency of their movements. He had not described trapping them because he had not needed to. She needed to. She spent 2 days studying the area around the cave for sign the oval prints in the snow. The compressed corridors where bodies had repeatedly pushed through the same gap between rocks, the small circular beds pressed into sheltered spots under overhanging granite. The hares were there. They were living on the same slope she was living on. She constructed 6 snares from wire and sticks, according to the principle she understood from reading a loop set at harehead height in a compressed travel corridor with guide sticks on either side to direct the animal into the loop rather than around it. She checked the snares at dawn each morning. The third morning, one snare held a snowshoe hare. It was clean and quick, and she was matter-of-fact about what followed, because she had grown up in Iowa and had not come from people who required their meat to arrive without relationship to its origin. The hare dressed out to about 3 pounds of good lean meat. She hung the carcass in the cold section of the cave near the entrance, where the temperature stayed consistently below freezing, and she began to think of the snare line as part of her food system rather than a supplement to it. She also went to Edmund. She walked down on a morning after a clear night when the snow surface had crusted enough to bear her weight with some reliability, moving carefully with a stick for balance. Edmund looked at her when she came through the door the way a man looks at something he'd quietly worried about and is relieved to see intact. She told him what she needed. She did not dress it in anything other than what it was. She had miscalculated the food she needed to extend her supplies on credit, and she was good for the debt when she had income in the spring. She put the number on the table, $8 worth of dried goods. Edmund wrote it in his ledger without making a production of it. "You've got credit here, Clara. Come back if you need more." She thanked him and left with her pack full of beans and cornmeal and dried apples. Edmund came to see for himself at the end of December. He arrived on a clear, cold morning in the deliberate manner of a man who has decided to do something and will not be talked out of it with a pack of his own carrying items. He said he'd meant to send up earlier and hadn't. He stood inside the cave for a long time after Clara let him in, looking at everything with the eyes of someone who knows enough to see past the surface. He tested the stove draw, pressing his palm over the pipe connection. He looked at the interior wall that divided the living space from the woodpile. He studied the way she'd positioned the sleeping platform relative to the thermal mass of the rear wall. He was quiet through all of this, making only occasional sounds of considered attention, and then he turned to her and said, "You did this in 6 weeks, in October with the cold coming." Clara met his gaze. "I didn't have the option of taking longer." He nodded slowly. "No," he said. "I suppose you didn't. It shows that you understood exactly what you needed." He looked around once more. "It also shows that you understood something most builders never learn, that the best material is the material that's already there." She gave him coffee and they sat by the stove and talked for 2 hours. She told him about how the granite walls acted as a buffer, storing heat from the stove burns and releasing it through the cold hours so that the temperature inside never dropped as sharply as the temperature outside. She explained that keeping the wood inside meant every piece she burned was fully dry. The efficiency gain was measurable in the fact that she was using roughly a quarter of the firewood that a surface dwelling of equivalent interior temperature would require. Edmund listened with the attention of a man encountering a perspective he hadn't considered. "You've built the fire inside the insulation," he said finally. She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "I suppose that's exactly what I've done." January arrived and brought with it the sustained, brutal cold that Silver King was capable of producing in a serious winter temperatures that stayed below zero for days at a stretch, wind that drove snow horizontal off the peaks, and built drifts against anything that gave it a reason to stop. The camp below was visible from certain points on the slope as a cluster of dark shapes in white smoke rising from every structure. The stamp mill silent for the first time she could remember, because even machinery had limits in this cold. The families down there were burning through firewood at rates that stressed their supplies. She heard this from Frank, who came up twice in January to help her check her snare line, not because she needed help with it, but because he was the kind of man who looked for concrete things to do with his concern for a person rather than expressing the concern directly. And she appreciated this form of care more than she would have appreciated the alternative. Late January. Frank came up alone on a morning after a night that had gone to minus 32 degrees. On the thermometer outside the general store, he knew because Edmund had marked it on the board he kept on the outside wall. He sat in the cave and looked at the thermometer she'd improvised by calibrating marks on a copper tube against known reference temperatures, and the tube read 58 degrees inside. 58 degrees when outside was 32 below zero. "That's a 90-degree difference," Frank said. Clara looked at him steadily. 90 degrees of difference from one side of that wall to the other. He looked at the wall. She watched him understand it not as an engineering principle, but as a lived fact, the way that understanding comes when you are sitting inside a thing rather than looking at it from outside. "Margaret," he said finally with the compression of a man who says a name when he means a much longer sentence. Clara understood. "Bring her up," she said. February brought the crisis she had heard about through Frank, the families in the camp who had burned through their external wood piles and were finding what remained to be frozen and wet and burning at a fraction of its dry value. Frank's wife, Margaret, came to the cave in the first week of February, walking up with Frank through knee-deep snow in the kind of determined silence that said she had formed an opinion and was coming to see whether it was correct. She walked into the cave and stood in the warmth for a moment without speaking. Then she went to the wood storage section and picked up a piece of firewood. She held it in both hands for a moment, the way a person tests the weight of something. She broke a small piece from a dry end. The crack was sharp high, immediate the sound of wood that carries no moisture. Margaret looked at the piece in her hand. She looked at her husband. She said with the economy of someone who owed no one a performance of humility, "Show us how to build this." Clara showed them. Not the cave itself, they did not have a cave, but the principle, a storage space that was fully enclosed, protected from precipitation from every direction, maintained at a stable temperature above freezing by the insulation of the surrounding earth. Frank could dig into the slope behind their company house and create the equivalent, not granite walls, but timber-shored earth, roofed with boards and turf with a door that sealed against weather. The principle was not the material. The principle was the enclosure and the stability. Frank built it in 4 days the following week. The spring and summer after that, 3 other families in the camp built similar structures, all of them different in construction, but identical in principle, and all of them derivative of a solution that Clara had arrived at by necessity rather than by study. She had not planned to teach anyone anything. She had planned to survive. But survival, it turned out, was a thing that had a shape other people could see and learn from, and she could not be in the mountains for a winter and keep it only for herself, even if she'd wanted to. By the end of February, she had used less than half her woodpile. She had enough food supplemented by the snare line to last through April comfortably. Her debt to Edmund was recorded in his ledger and would be repaid. The wall stood without settlement. The doors sealed against whatever the mountains sent. The fire burned clean every morning from wood that had never been wet. On a clear evening at the end of February, she sat at the entrance with the door open for the first time in weeks. The temperature had come up above freezing for an afternoon and the light lasted longer. Now the first thin signal of a season changing, and she held the cup in both hands and looked down at the camp and across at the far peaks, white and enormous in the last of the light. She was alive. She was warm. She had not asked anyone to save her, and no one had. She was going to need eventually to think about what came next, about income, about the spring, about what a life looked like beyond the single objective of making it through the winter. But not tonight. Tonight the wood was dry, and the stove was lit, and the peaks were going pink in the sunset, and that was sufficient. Then she looked at the small shelf beside the door where she kept her daily items, the tin cup, the matchbox, the gloves, and saw that she'd placed a letter there 2 days ago and had not yet decided what to do with it. The letter had come up through Edmund, who had received it from the camp messenger, who had received it from the Denver mail rider. The envelope had the letterhead of the Silver King Mining Company's engineering division. Inside was a card, stiff cream cardstock with clean printing, and below the printed name and title was a line of handwriting, careful and small. Mrs. Whitmore, I have read the letter your husband sent to the mine management in April of 1883. I believe we need to speak, at your convenience, not mine. O. Garrett. She had read it twice and set it down and had not picked it up again. The peaks went dark. She went inside and closed the door. She kept the letter on the shelf for 11 days. This was not avoidance in the way that avoidance usually operates, the active, not thinking, the deliberate steering of attention elsewhere. She thought about it. She thought about it with the same methodical attention she brought to every problem that had material consequences, which meant she turned it over in her mind the way she turned stones in the field, examining each face before deciding where it belonged. Owen Garrett, Engineering Division, April 1883. James's letter. She knew about the letter because James had told her the night he wrote it, sitting at the kitchen table of the company house with the lamp turned up and his handwriting compressed by the urgency of what he was trying to say. He had found stress fractures in the supporting column of Tunnel 4. Not fresh fractures, not the normal micro-cracking that granite produced under load cycling, but deep lateral splits running in the direction that meant the column was failing rather than settling. He had told his shift supervisor. The shift supervisor had told him he was reading the rock wrong, that the fractures were superficial, that the column had been assessed the previous quarter and was sound. James had not argued with the supervisor. He had gone home and written a letter to the mine management in Denver because he had spent enough years underground to know the difference between a man who was right and a man who was senior, and the supervisor was only one of those things. He had kept a cop because he kept copies of everything that might matter. The copy was in the wooden box under the bed in the envelope he'd labeled in his careful compressed hand, sent to Silver King Mine Management, April 14, 1883. She had found it in August when she opened the box for the first time. She had read it. She had put it back. And in October, when she'd packed the box for the move to the cave, she had taken the copy with her without deciding exactly why. The same instinct that had made her keep the knife from the cave floor, some bone-deep conviction that you did not abandon things that still had use in them. Garrett's card said he had read the letter. He had read the letter that had been sent to management in April. The letter that was presumably in a file somewhere in a Denver office, which meant it had arrived, which meant it had been received, which meant someone in that office had looked at James's careful documentation of a structural failure in progress and decided that documentation did not require action. 3 months later, James was dead, and the column he had identified was the one that came down. She picked up the card on the 11th day and wrote one line on the back of an envelope she addressed to Edmund for forwarding. Mr. Garrett, Edmund Hale's store, first Saturday in April, 9 in the morning. C. Whitmore. She sent it down with Frank on his next trip to the camp. The spring came into the mountains the way it always came at altitude, not as warmth but as the withdrawal of the worst of the cold, a tentative negotiation between winter and everything else conducted over 6 weeks of thaw and refreeze and tentative green at the lower elevations while the high slopes stayed white. Clara began extending her daily range walking further from the cave each morning, not from restlessness, but from practical assessment. She wanted to know the condition of the surrounding landscape. As the snow settled, wanted to understand what access would look like as the season opened, wanted to begin planning forward in the way that survival once secured permitted. Edmund's offer came in the first week of April, not as a surprise. She had seen it forming through the winter, in the way he spoke to her on her camp visits, in the particular attention he paid to how she worked through a problem, but as a relief nonetheless. The store needed someone to manage inventory and keep accounts. He was not, he said, with the candor of a man who had run a business alone for 15 years, naturally organized in the way that a store required its operator to be organized. He was good with people. He was good with product selection. He was poor with systems, and a store without systems was a store that lost money in small increments until the increments became consequential. He offered $25 a month in the room above the store, which was small, but had a window that faced east and caught the morning sun. Clara told him she would take it on one condition: she was keeping the cave. Edmund looked at her for a moment, then said that the cave on the public land north of camp was not his to have an opinion about, and she was welcome to it. She moved her working supplies down to the storeroom over 3 days, carrying the load in stages on the same route she'd been using all winter. She left the stove in the cave. She left the stone sleeping platform. She left James's journal on the shelf she'd cut into the wall, in the place she'd kept it through the winter, because the cave was not finished being what it was, and she was not finished being connected to it. She slept in the cave for 6 more weeks. Walking down to the store each morning and back up each evening before the practicality of the arrangement shifted enough that the room above the store became the more sensible base. The day she moved fully into the room, she went up to the cave in the afternoon and sat in it for an hour without doing anything. She sat on the stone platform with the door open and the April light coming in at its low angle and the fissure above doing its slow, quiet work of moving air, and she let the space be what it had been. Not just shelter, not just a construction project, not just evidence of what she was capable of when necessity removed every alternative. It had been all of those things. It had also been the place where she had spent a winter alone with James's journal and her own thoughts, and the sustained problem of being alive. And that combination had produced something in her that she could not name precisely, but could feel in the way she approached every subsequent task, a bedrock certainty that she was not going to be undone by difficulty, because she had already sat at the bottom of difficulty and looked around and found something to work with. She locked the door when she left. She kept the key. Owen Garrett arrived at Edmund's store on the first Saturday in April at 9:05, which suggested to Clara that he had not been in the immediate area and had traveled to make the appointment. He was 45, lean in the way of men who worked in the field rather than the office, with the particular quality of attention in his eyes that she associated with engineers, the habit of looking at a thing long enough to understand it rather than long enough to form an impression. He came in and identified himself to Edmund, who pointed to Clara without ceremony. Garrett crossed the store and extended his hand. She shook it. He said he was glad she had agreed to meet. She told him she didn't know yet whether she was glad. They walked up to the cave. This had not been explicitly arranged. She had simply, when he asked where they might speak privately, begun walking toward the path up the slope, and he had followed. He kept pace without comment, adapting to the terrain as she moved through it, and she noted this without making anything of it. A man who could not match her pace on her own mountain was not a man she needed to spend further time with. She opened the door and stepped aside and let him go in first. He stood in the cave the way Edmund had stood in it, long enough, quietly enough to indicate genuine assessment rather than polite acknowledgement. He looked at the wall from inside, studying the bond pattern of the face course she'd mortared, pressing a thumb into one of the joints to test the cure. He looked up at the fissure. He walked to the rear of the chamber and back, pacing off the depth. He examined the stove installation, following the pipe with his eyes to the point where it penetrated the wall and disappeared toward the natural chimney. He took out a small notebook and wrote in it for a minute without speaking. Then he turned to her and said what he'd come to say. He laid it out without preamble or softening. The Silver King Mining Company had retained him in the fall of 1883 to conduct an independent review of the July collapse of Tunnel 4. He had spent the winter in Denver reviewing records, not in Colorado, which was why he had not arrived at Silver King until this spring. In the course of his review, he had located James's letter in the management files. Not misfiled, not lost, placed in a folder labeled with the date of receipt, April 17th, 1883, with a notation in a different hand at the top that said, "Reviewed, no action required." The notation was initialed by the management supervisor who had left the company in August 1883, 3 weeks after the collapse at the company's request. Clara stood across the chamber from him and listened to this with her hands at her sides and her weight level and her breathing steady, because she had spent 5 months in conditions that had stripped away the reflexive emotional responses that ordinary life permitted, and left behind something more durable. She was not surprised. She was not newly devastated. She had known since she read the copy of James's letter in August, had known with the certainty of someone assembling evidence rather than seeking comfort, that what had happened was not an accident in the pure sense of the word. An accident was when all reasonable precautions had been taken and the outcome was nevertheless catastrophic. What had happened in Tunnel 4 was when a reasonable precaution had been specifically documented, specifically received, and specifically set aside by a person whose job was to act on it. She went to the shelf where she put the box before moving the rest of her things down to the store. She took out the envelope. She walked across the chamber and handed it to him. He looked at the outside James's handwriting, the date, the label. He opened the flap and took out the single folded page and read it. The cave was quiet while he read. When he finished, he looked up on her. "How long have you had this?" Clara's voice came out measured and precise. "Since the day I opened his box. August 1883. Garrett held the page as if deciding what weight to give it. "You kept it through the winter." She let the answer be silence because what she'd kept it through was not the winter specifically, but everything: the eviction, the building, the schon, the months of being alone on the mountain, and the winter was only one part of that. He asked what she wanted to do with what they now both knew. He laid the options out with the same professional clarity he'd used for everything else. A formal legal action against the company for which this letter and his findings would constitute significant evidence, and for which the likely outcome was a financial settlement substantially larger than $65. He said this not as advocacy, but as information, laying the geography of the situation and letting her choose her direction. She was quiet for long enough that he did not try to fill the silence. Then she said, "I don't want their money." Garrett's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, she thought, but the recalibration of a man who has just learned that the map he brought is not the map of the actual terrain. She continued before he could respond. What she wanted was not compensation. Compensation moved in one direction from the company toward her and left James exactly where he was, which was dead in a collapse that had been preventable, with his warning unacknowledged and his professional judgment unrecorded. Money would not change the record. What she wanted was the record changed. She wanted the company's formal documentation to reflect that James Whitmore had identified the structural failure in Tunnel 4 on or before April 14, 1883, had communicated that identification through proper channels, and that the failure of the mine to act on that communication had directly contributed to the July collapse. She wanted his name attached to a correct assessment that had been proven right by the worst possible evidence. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. She could not read the full content of the look, but she recognized one component of it: the quality of attention a person gives to something they are encountering for the first time and will not forget. "I can do that," he said. "The review report is mine to write. What you're asking for is what the facts require. I was going to write it that way regardless." She absorbed this. "Then write it that way," she said, "and tell me when it's done." He left that afternoon and returned to Denver to complete his report. The report was filed with the Colorado Mining Regulatory Office in June of 1884, and it stated plainly in the section dedicated to contributing causes that James Whitmore's April 1883 communication had correctly identified the structural conditions that led to the Tunnel 4 collapse, that this communication had been received by mine management and not acted upon, and that this failure of action constituted negligence on the part of the company's management representative. The management representative in question was not in the company's employ by the time the report was published. The report recommended changes to documentation requirements for structural reports from field personnel. Some of those recommendations were adopted, some were not. The report was a public document, which meant it could be read by anyone who looked for it, and James Whitmore's name was in it in the way she'd asked for. Attached to the truth. Edmund read her the relevant sections when the report arrived by mail in July. She did not ask him to. He did it because he understood that she needed to hear it out loud rather than read it alone, and he was right. When he finished reading, he closed the document and set it on the counter, and they stood in the store in the afternoon quiet, and neither of them said anything for a while. She had not expected it to feel the way it felt. She had expected relief, the clean, specific relief of a thing finished, a debt paid, an account closed. What she felt instead was something that took up more space than relief, something that required her to stand still and let it move through her and not try to categorize it while it was happening. James had been right. It was in the record now. The mountain had known it all along the way. Mountains know everything that happens on their slopes without judgment, without recourse, simply by being the place where it occurred. Now the people knew it too. Professor Alderton arrived from the Colorado School of Mines in September of 1884. A letter first, then the man himself on a Tuesday in early fall, with a student in tow and a surveying kit that suggested he intended to do this properly. He was 52 with the academic manner of someone who had spent 3 decades turning practical knowledge into transmissible form and had learned that the most valuable knowledge was usually the kind that practitioners carried without knowing it was knowledge. He had read Edmunds' account in the Leadville Chronicle and had seen the republication in the Denver Republican, and he had recognized in the description something that his field of study, passive environmental design, a subject he had been trying to establish as legitimate curriculum for 6 years, had been looking for a case study with a living practitioner who could explain not just what she'd done, but why. Clara had one condition, which she communicated in the letter before he arrived and confirmed in person when he came: any publication or lecture material derived from the study of the cave and its construction would identify James Whitmore as the person who discovered and documented the cave site, without whose record Clara would not have known it existed. Alderton agreed immediately and with what appeared to be genuine satisfaction rather than concession. The chain of knowledge matters, he said. How the solution was reached matters as much as what the solution was. Removing your husband from this story would be removing the first link in the chain. He spent 3 days at the site. He measured everything: the cave's natural dimensions, the wall thickness and height at multiple points, the position and dimensions of the chimney fissure, the angles of the entrance relative to compass, bearing, and solar path. He interviewed Clara for 4 hours over 2 sessions, asking questions that moved from the practical to the principled. Not just what she had done, but how she had decided to do it, what she had known in advance and what she had worked out by trial, what had succeeded immediately and what had required correction. She answered with the same factual precision she brought to everything, because she had nothing to protect and nothing to perform. She had made decisions under constraint, and some of them had been good and some had been wrong, and she had corrected the wrong ones when they revealed themselves. That was the full account. Alderton's report, when it appeared in 1892 in the Journal of Practical Engineering and Architecture, devoted 11 pages to the Silver King cave dwelling. It was titled Passive Thermal Design in High-Altitude Emergency Shelter, a case study from the Colorado Rockies, 1883. It described the cave's natural properties, the construction decisions Clara had made, and their engineering rationale, the thermal performance data Alderton had compiled by comparison with recorded weather data from that winter, and the way the design had influenced subsequent construction practices in the surrounding area. The paper credited James Whitmore in its second paragraph as the discoverer and documentarian of the cave site, and credited Clara Whitmore, by then Clara Garrett, as the designer and builder of the dwelling and the source of the engineering analysis that had guided its construction. It was, Alderton wrote in his introduction, an example of what he called necessity-driven engineering, the kind of design thinking that emerged when resource constraints were absolute and there was no option of over-engineering or purchasing a solution. Owen came back to Silver King in the spring of 1885, as he'd said he would when he left the previous spring. He came back again in the spring of 1886, and by then the pattern of his returns had acquired a shape that both of them recognized and neither of them had yet named. He had taken a position with a Colorado mining engineering firm based in Pueblo, which brought him to the western slope and the mountain districts regularly. He stopped at Edmunds' store each time he came through the area, and each time he stopped, he and Clara talked not with the social efficiency of people who have a limited topic, but in the way of people who keep finding new things the other person has thought carefully about and wants to understand. He brought engineering problems. She brought observations. The conversation moved fluidly between his domain and hers, which she had begun to understand were not as separate as her formal education, which had been functional rather than technical, would have suggested. He showed her the ventilation plans for a new tunnel system he was designing in the spring of 1886, spreading them on Edmunds' counter on a morning when the store was quiet. She looked at them for 10 minutes without speaking, following the air paths with a finger that did not quite touch the paper. Then she pointed to a section in the lower left quadrant, a chamber at the junction of two lateral shafts, and said, "That pocket will trap air. If there's a fire in the main shaft, the smoke goes everywhere except out." Garrett bent over the plans and traced the path she'd described. The silence that followed had the quality of a man rechecking his own arithmetic and finding an error he should have caught. "What would you do with it?" She picked up the pencil he'd set beside the plans and drew a short diagonal line 2 inches long, connecting the dead-end chamber to the upper shaft. "You need a bypass. Anything that could trap will trap eventually." He looked at the line for a moment. "How do you know this?" She looked up at him, and the answer was not a boast, but a simple statement of how understanding was acquired. "I spent 5 months solving ventilation problems in a space I could not leave. You learn what traps and what flows when leaving is not available to you." He corrected the plans. He sent a note to the firm in Pueblo citing the revision, and in the note he described the source of the correction, Mrs. Clara Whitmore of Silver King, Colorado, whose practical knowledge of enclosed space airflow had identified a design flaw that formal review had not. The firm's senior engineer wrote back asking who she was. Garrett wrote back telling them. The exchange was filed and became, in its small way, part of the record. He proposed on a morning in April 1886, standing at the door of the cave on the slope above the camp. He had asked Clara the day before if she would meet him there, which she had, not knowing what the meeting was for, and she arrived to find him standing at the door of the cave in the early light with the look of a man who has prepared something carefully and is now uncertain about the preparation. He said, "The first time I came to this door, I knocked, and you told me you did not receive visitors, and closed it before I had time to say another word." This was true. He had come up one afternoon in April of 1884, before their first real conversation, while she was still sleeping in the cave, and she had opened the door, assessed him in 3 seconds, and shut it again without ceremony. She had not known who he was. She had known only that she had not invited anyone and had work to do. "I've thought about that door a lot," he said. "I'd like to ask if you'll open it again." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him, doing the same assessment she applied to everything she encountered. Not sentiment first, but structure, what this was made of, whether it would hold under load. Everything she had observed about Owen Garrett in the 2 years since that first real meeting told her that he was what he appeared to be, a man who said true things, kept his word, understood that intelligence in another person was not a complication, but a gift. She stepped to the side of the door and pushed it open and stood back, and he walked into the cave, and that was that. They married in the summer of 1886 at a small ceremony in Silver King, with Edmund standing on one side and Frank and Margaret Dolan on the other, and the peaks visible through the window in their permanent white, impartial and enormous, having no opinion about the proceedings below. They built a house on a parcel of land Owen purchased on the lower slopes east of camp, on a site Clara had identified the previous fall for its specific combination of characteristics: south-facing slope for solar gain, natural windbreak from a granite outcropping, to the north good drainage running away from the building site. Owen designed the structure. He was better with the load calculations and material specification, and Clara designed the thermal logic. The walls on the south and west faces were stone, locally quarried 2 feet thick, positioned to absorb the afternoon sun and hold it through the night. The north wall was insulated with a double layer of timber and packed with dry sawdust from the mill. The woodshed was not a shed, but an underground chamber accessed through the kitchen, dug 4 feet into the slope behind the house, roofed with timber and sod, maintaining a temperature through the coldest months that kept the wood perfectly dry and ready. The windows were large on the south face and small on the north. The stove was positioned against the interior stone wall so that the mass of the wall amplified its output. On the coldest recorded night of the winter of 1887, the house maintained an interior temperature of 62 degrees, using less firewood than the company houses in the camp below burned in an average evening. Owen sent the design specifications to his firm in Pueblo. The firm incorporated several of the principles into their subsequent recommendations for residential construction in high-altitude mining districts. They credited the design to the Garretts jointly, which was accurate in the way that joint credits are accurate when 2 people have contributed different things to the same outcome, and the outcome could not have been achieved without both contributions. The cave remained as it was. Clara went up 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes with Owen, sometimes alone, checking the condition of the wall and the door and the stove installation. The wall showed no settlement. The mortar on the face courses remained intact, the joints tight, the batter angle holding true. The door rehung on new hardware in 1888 after the original hinges wore through, opened and closed as it always had. The chimney fissure drew as it always had drawn, indifferent to the decades of fires and the decade of no fires. Frank and Margaret Dolan left Silver King in 1901 when the mine closed and moved to Pueblo, where Frank found work in the smelting industry. Before they left, Margaret came to the store to say goodbye. She stood with Clara in the back of the store where the inventory shelves were among the organized rows that Clara had spent 7 years building into a system of near-perfect legibility, and she said something that was not sentimental in its framing, but was not anything other than sentiment in its content. You were the only person in this camp who was stupider than us and smarter than us at the same time. Clara looked at her. Margaret clarified, stupid enough to stay on that mountain, smart enough to make it work. Clara said, I had good material to work with. Margaret understood that she did not mean the stone. Edmund retired in 1891 and sold the store to a younger man from Gunnison, but did not leave Silver King. He was 66 and had no other place to be, and the mountains had got into him in the way that things did when you stayed long enough. He spent his remaining years doing what he had always done between customers, reading, building small things with his hands, and occasionally walking up the slope to sit in the cave with Clara, who never stopped going there. He died in 1898 at 73 in his own bed in the house he'd lived in for 23 years. Clara sat with him at the end because she was the person he wanted there, and she knew it without being told. In 1889, Clara and Owen took in 2 children, orphaned by a fire at the stamp mill, that killed their parents within a month of each other, a girl of 7 and a boy of 9. This was not a formally announced decision. Clara simply brought them home one evening after the second death, and Owen looked at them and then at Clara and understood what had already been decided. The children grew up in the house on the east slope with the stone walls and the underground woodshed and the view of the peaks that their parents considered ordinary, because it was what they had always seen. When they were old enough, Clara told them the story of the cave. The girl, who was 17 by then, climbed up with Clara to see it. She stood in the chamber and turned slowly in the lamplight and said, "You built this alone." Clara looked at the wall she had built stone by stone in the October cold of 1883, now more than 20 years standing still, sealed, still carrying the particular character of something that has found its final relationship with the forces acting on it. "I had very good instructions," she said. The girl waited. "My husband found the cave. A man named Edmund taught me the principles. A man named Frank helped me with the parts I couldn't do alone." She paused. "The building was mine, but nothing is built alone." Professor Alderton's 1892 paper was read in engineering schools and practical construction circles across Colorado and into Wyoming and Utah. The technique of underground or semi-underground wood storage spread through the mountain communities of the western slope, not through any organized program, but through the natural transmission of practical knowledge. Someone tried it, it worked, they told someone else who tried it, and so on. The principle of thermal mass in high-altitude residential construction was incorporated into the curriculum. Alderton eventually established at the School of Mines taught to engineers who went out and built mines and infrastructure across the region. The cave was the source of all of it, in the way that sources are not always visible from the downstream point, but present in everything the water touches on its way there. Clara bought the store back from the Gunnison man in 1904 and ran it for another 16 years before selling it for the last time in 1920. She kept the accounts with the same precision she'd brought to Edmund's ledger 30 years earlier, and the store under her management turned a consistent profit through years when the mining district contracted and expanded and contracted again, because she had learned in the winter of 1883 that the difference between surviving and not surviving was almost always a question of knowing exactly where every resource was and what it was worth. The team of geologists who found the cave in 1920 were mapping mineral deposits on the Silver King Ridge and found the entrance by stumbling on it, the brush having grown back considerably in the years since Clara had last maintained the clearing around the door. The geologist who documented it, Robert Calloway, according to the survey report, had filed with the Colorado Geological Survey, pushed the door open and went inside with a lamp and wrote in his field notes, with the direct surprise of a man who expected to find a natural feature and found instead something that someone had thought carefully about. Interior of granite cave approximately 30 by 15 feet at maximum. Stone dry-laid wall closing entrance, expertly constructed, no settlement visible. Cast iron stovepipe to natural chimney fissure intact. Stone sleeping platform, interior partition wall. Carved storage niches. The construction suggests considerable knowledge of passive thermal design. Per local historical records, built 1883 by Clara Whitmore, subsequently Clara Garrett, who wintered here alone. Wall remains structurally sound. Remarkable example of what minimal material investment, guided by genuine understanding of the site's natural properties, can achieve. Callaway's field notes were incorporated into the survey report, and the report was filed with the Colorado Geological Survey in Denver, where it joined the accumulated documentary record of the Silver King District. James Whitmore's name was already in that record in Garrett's 1884 review report. Now Clara's name was there as well in the handwriting of a stranger who had pushed open a door she'd hung in 1883 and found it still worked. Clara Whitmore Garrett died in April of 1924, 80 years old, in the house on the east slope that she and Owen had built in 1886. Owen was with her. The two children they'd raised were with her, grown now with families of their own, who filled the house in the last weeks in the way that houses fill when the person who gave them their character is leaving. She had been in good health until the final months, walking the lower slopes regularly and going up to the cave twice a year in the spring and fall with the same methodical attention to its condition that she'd brought to every structure she'd ever maintained. Owen survived her by 4 years. He died in 1928 at 87, having spent the 42 years of their marriage doing what he had always done, building things carefully, correcting errors when he found them, and paying attention to the person next to him. In the obituary he wrote for her in the spring of 1924, published in the Leadville Chronicle, and reprinted in Denver, he wrote one paragraph that the editors considered cutting for length and did not. Clara did not use the word survive to describe what she did in the winter of 1883. She thought the word implied that survival was the achievement when survival was only the condition that made the achievement possible. What she achieved was a building stone walls, a working chimney, a dry wood pile constructed alone from local material in 6 weeks in October at 9,000 feet with $65 and a dead man's journal for resources. The building stood for 64 years. It outlasted the company that evicted her. It outlasted the mine. It outlasted most of what Silver King built in that period. She was not trying to prove anything. She was trying to live. But the things we build when we are trying to live have a way of lasting longer than the things we build for any other reason. The cave entrance was sealed by a small rockfall in 1947 when a section of the overhang above the door finally concluded its long negotiation with gravity. The wall inside was still standing when it was covered. The door was still on its hinges. The stove was still connected to the fissure. The journal was on the shelf.